I'd like very much, I'm just delighted and thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Flavia Bastos, my sister from IUB, and associate professor at the University of Cincinnati, associate professor of art education. She's also served as a senior editor for the Art Education Journal, and is a very respected and very critical voice in our field, and we are thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Michael and Melody and Kevin. This has been a warm welcome, and I'm thrilled to be here. Art education is a field that it's really about connections, I think, and I'm proud to be a part of that community and serve it in all the capacities I've been able to serve it so far. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my thoughts about art education. We are going to have two conversations, one today and one tomorrow. Let me get this going. And Mel, would you keep me honest and keep it kind of aware of the time? Because
We'll let you talk all night, honey, because your voice is so wonderful to listen to.
yeah, well, we'll see about that. If I talk too much, it will be only in Portuguese, perhaps. So there will be two talks. The talk of today's talk is really going to focus on my work in urban art education. And I didn't start out thinking that that was my calling or a particular direction in which my research would unfold, but a series of circumstances led to that. So in this talk today, I'm going to provide you with the background that informs what is written in the book, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about sort of the ins and outs of how I really do that work in Cincinnati, because I've been a professor at the University of Cincinnati this is my 12th year, and at UC I found a great site to implement some of these ideas that have inspired my whole journey in art education, from being an elementary school teacher in schools in southern Brazil to going on into a graduate program where Mel and I shared an amazing mentor, and to going on and becoming a professor and training teachers and so on and so forth. Q&As are typically at the end, but they don't have to be. If at any point you are burning with a question or you need a clarification, please interrupt me. I won't be offended. I will be quite pleased. So this whole notion that education is not a neutral practice, education is a social practice that can affect social change, really informs my work. And I'm going to tell you how I get to that. All of us are educators because of some kind of personal narrative that helps us inform our identities and from which we make sense of what we do. And my identity is informed by my heritage and my history and the history of the place I grew up in. So I was born in '67, and that was a time, if you think of '68 and all the revolutions in '68 in Europe and the United States, Brazil's narrative is a little bit behind that. What had happened in Brazil in '64 was the beginning of a military dictatorship, which was put in place with help of the CIA, that was very concerned about all the socialist waves of development in Latin America, which are now coming back, by the way. So most nations in Latin America had a dictatorship of one shape or another. We had a military junta that was in power for over 20 years. And one of the things that the military did was, of course, curtail of civil liberties, but also increase censorship of the arts. Because the arts were a mechanism by which ideas of change and transformation could be transmitted to a large population. So the arts became, in the mid-'60s through the early '80s, a real tool of social organization, of resistance, in a very coded language. So there would be MPB, Brazilian popular music songs put out that would have these metaphors that wouldn't, at face value, would mean one thing. And then for those in the know, there would be all these coded messages of resistance and transformation. So from my very upbringing, art was always enmeshed with this notion of social change and resistance. I also come from the, if you know the geography of Brazil, it's kind of an inverted triangle. I come from the very tip of the triangle. Not your tropical Brazil. I come from subtropical Brazil with 4 seasons and winter and deciduous trees and lots of European immigrants. You can't tell looking at me, but there are lots of Germans and Italians. And it's also one of the regions in Brazil where racial discrimination is the most rampant. So I come from this unusual family. I have a father of African descent. He's a mulatto, a mix of Caucasian and black folks, and I have an European descent mother. I never thought very much about that because that's how I grew up, but that is very unusual from the middle class fabric of that region of the country. So my interest in my own cultural heritage has informed my work as well. So as I was telling you about this time and this place, there were always lots of underground social movements. Paulo Freire, who is probably one of the most well-known Brazilian educators, was creating campaigns of adult literacy that were also campaigns of political literacy to really empower the people who were oppressed, who were outside the decision-making process in society. The Catholic Church had a very important role in sustaining some of these movements. And if you ever heard of liberation theology, which is something that our current Pope is not very interested in anymore, the premise of liberation theology is a kind of religious practice that says that sin is a structural factor in the world. So in a way, unjust social structures are sinful. And the charge of a good liberation theology Catholic is to change the world. It's not wait for a better life in an afterlife, but to change the life that we have now. So you can see all these disparate elements really inform my social change orientation. And Paulo Freire is a very important figure in shaping my art education vision. When I came to grad school in the 90s, there was, I'm going to say very little because I actually want to say no writing in art education that really used Paulo Freire's ideas. I was having a conversation with Enid Zimmerman just a few days ago, and she said, I never wrote anything quoting Freire until you came to my door as a grad student. So you can see you all have a very important mission in keeping us, professors, current and embracing new ideas. And I was happy to know that I shaped my wonderful mentor's ideas as well. So I came to the West in the 90s, and I geographically and symbolically crossed many boundaries in order to do that. I didn't speak English. I spoke French because French was the sophisticated thing to do, and I like sophisticated things, so I thought I was, a blooming intellectual, I should speak French. So I did. So I came to the US to grad school with the English of a 4-year-old, more or less. But I also found myself in a time in the 90s, multicultural education was really taking hold of art education in this country. We were very interested in different cultures, and people would ask me, tell me about your Brazilian culture. Tell me about being Brazilian. And it was the most difficult question to respond to because, your culture is like the water in a fish tank. You don't see it. So I didn't know what to say about Brazilian culture because I never stopped to think about it very much. So a lot of my early work in art education really had to do with issues of cultural heritage and how cultural heritage and social class are interwoven. The aspects of one's cultural heritage that get transmitted, that get valued or devalued, and how that intermingles with social class. So my first work in our ed had to do with community-based arts education. I was really interested in the potential of communities as a site of educational experience. So I did work in rural areas in Orleans, Indiana. I did some work back in Brazil in some very small projects. But I was really interested in knowing what happens when you expand the classroom walls to really use the community as an anthropological site of research. And the theoretical framework that helped inform that was, Derrida, who talks about border studies, and Mel and I have done a lot of work using post-colonial theory, ideas, and really trying to understand the kinds of power tensions that happen in post-colonial contexts, the same kinds of power tensions that happen at the border. If you think about the way the United States, for example, conceptualizes its borders, and all the discourse about that we are going to hear tomorrow, I'm sure, at the presidential debate, about how we enforce borders or how we have more, porous borders, and what does that mean. But something very interesting happens at the borders, because no matter how we try to enforce them and how separated we are by virtue of nationality or culture or language, borders are really a contact zone. They are a space where cultures and people come into contact with one another and transform each other. And something very interesting happens at the border. So I'm very interested in that space, and I conceive of educational practice as problematizing and exploring the borders. And some of that borders are the cultural borders of the teachers who come into contact with children. Most often we don't share the same culture and the same experiences, and we are co-creating knowledge in that context. So I love the work of this contemporary Brazilian artist by the name of Anabela Geiger, because I think it embodies visually some of the interesting dimensions of the borders, and it can serve as an inspiration for us as educators. Could I have a brave person who doesn't trust me yet, but will at the end of the day, describe what you see and how do you think this work is made? Dr. Davenport will give you extra credit points. However you do that. Yes, please.
It looks like tile.
Why do you say that?
I'm looking at just the outer borders.
This?
Yeah, and just the lines, it look like the texture of a tile. I don't know how they do that. It looks like a tile to me.
So it has a certain three-dimensionality to it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else has another different guess? Yes?
I mean, it looks like a map, especially the right side.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of looks like, I don't know, like it was, like there's burns or like something, I don't know, like burned paper on the outsides.
Okay.
It looks like kind of in addition to what she's saying, it looks like homemade paper almost.
Okay.
Like it looks like it's really heavy, it looks like it's gone through like the filter several times and you just kept adding layers and adding layers onto it.
Any other perspective? These are great. Yes.
It looks like a found object, like something that might have been trash at one point, or that might have just been part of, broken parts of someone's home, maybe.
What makes you say that?
Because it looks damaged and rusted. It just kind of looks like something that
this?
was found. Yeah, like the edges are rusted, and it looks like it was something that was damaged that was made into something new.
Okay.
To me, it looks like some sort of like copper or tin, and then it's got like the strings going down and then across.
Uh-huh.
What do you mean?
All right. So let me tell you a little bit more about this work, although I think you got it. This artist uses file drawers and she fills them with wax. So it is a 3D, and then she uses copper to create this imaginary cartographies in which she explores the dual duality of being a woman artist, where you are already second class, but also being a Brazilian artist, because Brazilian artists are outside of the axis of New York, Europe. that informs, the mainstream discourse about the art world. So it's a dual, it's a dual periphery. And she's exploring that in this imaginary cartography. Actually, it's a series of works, and the title is Orbis Descriptio, which is Latin for description of the world. So I find this inspiring, because in education, if we are going to take sort of the downtrodden route that Jonathan Kozol has taken, we get to describe the pretty abysmal conditions that we see in public schools all over the country and all over the world. But I am an optimist, perhaps. And I like to think about the possibility of imagining a different kind of school, a different kind of urban school. So I'm going to invite you to join me in that journey of reimagining urban education. So I'm really interested in artworks, art experiences, educational experiences that cross borders. And this is another example by a Brazilian artist, and just in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you about this work, although we could do the same thing of analyzing it. This is Mestre Didi, and he's an 80-year-old Afro-Brazilian priest. And his work is religious in meaning. As an Afro-Brazilian priest, he is a priest of a deity, Xaxará and Ibiri, who are represented as sacrificial brooms that clean the way for good things. So you can see the fiber here that is evocative of these brooms. And then you can see the cowrie shells and all other elements that evoke African traditions. But since the 1970s, he's been exhibited all over the world as a fine artist, although he doesn't have academic training, because his work has the kind of formal quality that we can relate to it. So it's another example of sort of this cross-boundary work. In 2004, I believe, I had an article in Studies in Art Education where I talk about his work as sort of straddling different traditions. And because a lot of artwork does that, I think it's important that we become aware of those works and we can use them in our teaching to really show students how different cultural codes can be mingled together and the transformative power of doing that. So back in the 90s, when I was a doctoral student, I did work in Orleans, Indiana. I said I was doing work in community settings. And in Orleans, Indiana, I was interested in learning about their local culture. That culture that was so familiar that folks couldn't talk about it. When I got to Orleans in '98, I want to describe local art forms. So I went to talk to people and I asked, tell me about the local arts in a poor, white, rural community in southern Indiana. What do you think I heard? We've got no art, ma'am. And I thought I had no dissertation. So I panicked, but because I'm an optimist, I thought, this doesn't sound right. Art is really so enmeshed in human fabric. How can they have no art? Well, they didn't think that they had art in the sense of academic art. Nobody in that community had learned to draw and paint. And that was the number one reason why they couldn't call themselves artists. But there were lots of makers, people who were fully engaged in creative practices. And they would have very interesting expressions to describe themselves. I'm a back porch carver. I'm a country landscape painter. There were all these qualifiers because they just didn't feel empowered to own the label artist quite yet. So in my 7-8 month research in Orleans, Indiana, I was able to list 56 artists. People who were, actively making stuff. And here you have some examples. You have Marilyn Morgan, who had a barn on back of her house where she taught local folks about memory painting. People would come with a picture. This is where I got married. This is where my parents lived, and I want to paint. I want to memorialize that site, and she would teach folks how to do that. We had a tradition of furniture in Indiana. We had an art teacher who taught kids in school about furniture making, real furniture making, made out of wood and tacks and glue, not, you know, something made out of cardboard, and took kids to visit the local furniture factory so that they could engage in that. We had a lady who made baskets just because. She started collecting them and then she got into making them. And the same woman, also, this is her pantry. She had 8 children, and she lived in an old farmhouse, and the walls were never finished, so she built these shelves. And you can see here pattern, right? At the same time I was reading about Eastern US folklore, where pattern is such an important organizing force in material culture. And as a foreigner, as an outsider, I could see it. That was so different from my culture, where you have produce growing year round. You don't can, you don't store, you don't need to. And you know, you would see people with jars and canned goods. That was so foreign to me. So I walk into Marilyn's kitchen pantry and I see, boom, it's patterned. It's each to its own, you know. It's just like a quilt, you see? So it was very interesting to me to kind of throw back at people what I was seeing, and they were changing their own perception of who they were. By the end of my study, I had folks digging for artwork that they have made years before and hanging them on walls, or documenting things that, heritage that may have gotten lost. So I call that the process of making the familiar strange, introducing in a community context something, some experience, some force that would change the way people perceived their everyday surroundings. And I conceptualize of the work of an art educator as that of a critical kind of literacy, very much like Paulo Freire talked about the work that he did with illiterate adults. Actually, I had this recollection from when I was an undergraduate. We were reading one of Paulo Freire's texts, and he's talking about a literacy campaign in an African fisherman village of Port São Tomé and Príncipe. And Freire's methodology uses something that he calls a codification, which is essentially an image. And from that image, people get to talk about their circumstances, and then the words and the sentences that they are going to learn to read and write are derived from that situation. So in this fisherman village, he had a depiction of the village. And the fishermen were sitting on the floor and they were talking about what they were seeing. And at some point, one of the fishermen gets up and looks out of the window and looks back at the codification and looks back and forth and back and forth, and he says, "This is our village. Our village is this way, and I didn't know it." So it's the possibility of representing one's situation through art, through writing, through poetry, through music, you know, many ways to represent, to symbolize, but that is the key idea. So literacy involves the power of representation and the power of interpretation. Those are two related skills. And art educators need to be aware of that. And that's why when we look at the tradition in American art education, where we so value studio practice, and studio practice is awesome, don't get me wrong. But we also need to be very skilled at interpreting the works that are created by others. In order to be truly educated in the arts, you need to have skill and competencies in both. And also sort of all of that theory and all of my experiences seem to position me to think that the best place to start is locally. You know, you start very close, you start with your community. That has a lot of transformative potential. that should not be ignored. So from the late 90s, I landed a job in Cincinnati. And when I came to the University of Cincinnati, there was a program that already existed called Art in the Market. And the Art in the Market program was created by a young architect who was very passionate for the local history and the historical heritage of Cincinnati. I don't know if you know this, but Cincinnati has a very important history in the United States. It was coined the Queen City of the West because the Ohio River enabled all these products and materials to come to Cincinnati and in that sense support the expansion to the west. So it was the greatest metropolis farther west from the coast, and that's where the expansion to the west started. So, you know, from the 1700s on, this has been a very important place in the nation's history. And the young architect who started Art in the Market was interested in honoring that history. But he was also inspired by a lot of urban developments and the idea that community-based youth programs have something very important to offer, and that art plays a dramatic role in urban renewal. And there are lots of people tapping on that idea. Folks like Richard Florida, who says, you know, if you want to revitalize a city, get a bunch of gays and artsy guys to come, and things will be much better. Import your, you know. Anyway, I have my differences with Florida, but you get the notion. And historically, we've seen that. We've seen that urban cores may have very desirable neighborhoods now that at some point in the 70s were, you know, up for grabs, and the hippies moved in and they beautify it. They created a vision, enacted a vision that nobody saw. And artists can do that. So art is a very important element. A vibrant arts community is a very important element in a vibrant city. If we think about contemporary art practices where artists are very much interested not only in the product of what they do, but how they do it, how what they do can empower and strengthen certain groups. So all of those vectors kind of contribute to that kind of work. The Art in the Market program is an year-round program, and it's a partnership between the University of Cincinnati and the local community. It's a year-round program in which we recruit urban teens. For part of the year, they come to the University of Cincinnati, they take classes. It's very sad to hear about these urban teens' arts experiences. Many of them never held a drawing pencil, never worked with drawing paper, never been to a ceramics studio. Most of their art education consists of writing pencils and line paper. And I'm not sure it's the school that's under-resourced or the imagination of our schools that is in crisis. But anyhow, they get it. DAP, the college where I teach, is a very interesting college. It has 4 schools, design, one of the best design programs in the world, architecture, fine arts, and urban planning. So they get exposed to all these different disciplines that involve the arts. They learn to use the library. They learn to go to the local museums. They look at public art on campus. And then in the second part of the program, they are part of a service learning course that I teach, or my graduate students teach, where we partner with a community partner and we create a community-based work of art. Meaning, we engage collectively in designing the work based on a need or an interest that was identified. So it's not a site-specific work in which the visual artist holds the power. You know, we may have the vision of a 13-year-old have the same importance as the one of a 75-year-old resident, as the one of the funder who is giving us the money to do the project. And to level the playing field, to use a sports metaphor, is a very interesting and delicate process. But I make very clear that that's how this is going to come about. Here we have some examples of kids during the summer. We used to have funding from the Ohio Arts Council to do summer projects, and the kids were then employed after their year-long experience to do a project in the summer. So here they are, gathering in a public space. Also, it's called Art in the Market, but I didn't explain why. Cincinnati has had a public market since 1852 called Finley Market. It's one of the oldest operating markets in the United States. And the market is one of those border spaces. It's a place where different people bring their goods, and when people of all social classes and backgrounds commingle, where African Americans come for chitlins and fancy restaurant owners come for seafood, and they all, cohabit that space. So it has a rich symbolic content, and the program has tried to honor that heritage. What you have here is an image of the installation of the latest project. The idea was to create this sounding boards, really, because there are so many African Americans who live in that area of town. There is always music. There are always people making noise on whatever they can find. So we talked to the owner of this building who allowed us to use this space, and we created a bench. And here are panels that had various found objects that enable people to make music. I was telling a little bit about the history of Cincinnati, so let me tell you about the history of this neighborhood. This neighborhood where the market is located is called Over the Rhine because the Germans who came to Cincinnati saw a canal that existed in that neighborhood and thought it looked like the Rhine River. So ergo, Over the Rhine. And since the 1970s, this has been the port of entry of immigrants into our community. It is the largest collection of Italianate architecture in the United States. And German culture and heritage really unified that community for a long time until the anti-German sentiment during Second World War. So these are some other examples of projects. These were panels painted on plywood, generated from candid shots of residents. These panels were covering the market when it was undergoing renovation. Some of the goals of the project are to improve the visual and aesthetic environment around Finley Market District, to provide a program that promotes interactivity and the reward of community-based artwork, improving the community and providing employment for the youth. It provides a sense of ownership and empowerment to the residents of the Finley Market District through the participation of the youth. When I started this program, my notion of community, I have to say, was a very middle-class notion. As a girl, I lived in one street, and then my parents bought a house not too far away, and then I moved from there to college. So my geography of my growing up is very contained. So when I think about community, I think about sort of this geographical community, with borders and limits. My African American teens, when they talk about community, they really talk about their relationships. So they may be living over the Rhine now, but they have a relative who lives in another neighborhood of town, and they negotiate the public bus service, and their community is the people they know. So I had to change my conception to really understand community in a broader, richer, more complex sense. In 2001, we had riots in the city of Cincinnati because an African American teen, during spring break week, was shot and killed by a police officer. He was running away from the police, and the police officer deemed that he had a gun, which he didn't, and shot and killed him. And that led to civil unrest in the city, and then we had days of curfew. We were in the national news and so on and so forth. And I was teaching the service learning class at that point, discussing with my art educators and college students about the racial issues that they may be facing teaching urban students. And of course, all my middle class white students said, no biggie, we got this, race is not an issue. But when the riots erupted and we started talking about our racially based expectations of the police, we realized that we had absolutely different experiences. The middle class white folks kind of trusted the police, right? And the African American kids didn't. And we were able to engage in what's called critical race discourse. We really understood that how we experienced reality was based on our race and our social class. And that was very transformative for my students and for the African American teens as well. So the riots led to some destruction around the Finley Market area. And we were able to create these temporary murals that say unity in the community, to sort of convey our hopes for resolution of what was happening in Cincinnati. I'm going to just very briefly show you a few other works that were created as part of Finley Market, of the Art in the Market project. We have a collection of over 60 works of art all over the community, not only in the Market District anymore. This is a bench that was designed to go across a very popular fried chicken restaurant that was very small to accommodate people so that people could eat at these benches. There was an overall design that was created by the urban teens and the college students in my course, but there was a possibility for local people to contribute to the overall design by decorating these individual tiles. This is a mosaic that wraps around a playground, and it was done all using recycled materials. Just in terms of the history of the program, from 2002 to 2006, we partnered with a number of organizations and created works primarily in the Market District. And then in 2007, I wrote 2 grants because that was the 10th anniversary of the Art in the Market program. And we worked with University of Cincinnati alumna, Debbie Broad, who helped us design 2 works to celebrate sort of the bridges that the program creates between the community and the university. One of the works was going to be installed in the community and the other one at the university. And I also was able to start a longitudinal study in which I interviewed participants from the 10 past years of the program, and I can tell you more about what they say. So this is Deb and my students installing the work that we created. These are all recycled pieces of wood, either from the wood shop in the college or from the Finley Market community. And the names you kind of see here are the names of all the participants of the program up to that time. So that is a process for doing that kind of work that I think can inform our art education practices in a variety of urban settings, be they school settings or not. The notion of bridging expertise, which is a Paulo Freirean notion that everybody has some knowledge. Some people have book knowledge, some people have know-how, and this knowledge is not necessarily better or more valuable than each other. We need all of that, and we need to bridge those expertises. The idea of creating and working in a multidisciplinary team, of using dialogue and collaboration as a methodology, which is very much like the way contemporary artists work today, using recycled materials, issuing various invitations because people don't accept your invitation right off the bat. They have no reason to trust you. They actually said that to me. You are a university person, why should I trust you? Yeah, you're right. Reaching to a larger community in the city and the university, really letting people know about the work that you are doing. Valuing intergenerational activities, because everybody has some knowledge and how important it is to validate one's heritage in the form of the knowledge of elders. Respect and trust. So I'll give you a second to read these excerpts from the teams who worked in the Art in the Market project. They really value the idea that the program created an opportunity for them to engage in situations that were new, to talk to people they would not have talked to before. In doing the longitudinal study, you would think that they would say all amazing things about learning about art. And they did, they were very excited about art, but they were really excited about the way they saw themselves, completely different, as being able to knock on the mayor's door, or call City Hall, or look up a grant, or drafting an idea for a project, or putting a proposal together, or thinking about a budget of what it would cost to make that artwork. It was about these real life experiences. And in a way, that is art, I think. It's the best kind of art. Are you true? Okay. And this is the college student's perspective. And at that time, and I think it's probably still true today, I teach in this renowned art school, but the fine art students have no training in working collaboratively. All they do is render their individual vision. So it was like pulling teeth to tell them that all of a sudden they needed to negotiate whatever images they had inside their heads with the ideas that everybody else had. So I really love this last quote. The language of making art has changed for me. So just to underscore how we do this transformational work, we really start close to home. And Laura Williams, who is a Over the Rhine president, says it the best. No one is worthless. Everybody has some talent. Everything we need is right there in the gutter. And if you read the first chapter of the book, you know that I talk a lot about asset-based community development, ABCD. And this is the premise of asset-based community development, is that you can look at any situation and look for what is needed. But that kind of developmental model is not conducive for sustainability, because you always got to be plugging in the need. But if you look at assets, if you look at what is there in the gutter or at another interesting place, you know what to build from. So I think that asset-based community development, which is a methodology from urban planning and community development, really can provide a very interesting and useful set of tools for us to expand our urban imaginary so that we can imagine cities and education in a completely different way. In a way in which, and I know, American schools are going the science and technology route, but there may be another route to take where the arts have a very important role to play, and where cities and schools can again be in true collaboration toward the best kind of humanistic education that kids deserve. And I think this is a sustainable proposition because schools, neighborhoods, cities, art and education can really help not only to advance education, but to advance cities and advance our quality of life. So, I talked about borders, I talked about context zones, so let me leave you with the idea of encounters. And I had to use this image because This is a tavern in Cincinnati. And isn't there a better place to imagine what doesn't exist than a bar? There is no better place, right? It's the third place. It's that place that is in between the space, right? It's not work, it's not home life. It's not my work responsibility, it's not my life responsibility. It's that in-between place. So in those places, very interesting things happen. So I wanted to think of encounter as something that happens in an interesting place. But I want you to think not in the commonsensical way that we think about encounter. We think about encounter as, I met somebody I knew, I said hello. We think of encounter as recognition. But Deleuze really talks about encounter as something that moves the soul, perplexes it. In other words, forces it to pose a problem. Encounter is like the making it the familiar strange idea that I started with in the 90s. Encounter is what forces us to interpret what we know in a different way. And that's what we need to embrace as educators. Maxine Green also suggests that encounters engender the capacity to surpass the given and look at things as if they could be otherwise. And that's the most radical, most transformative act of imagination. And that is what educators have to do every day of their lives, is to imagine things as if they could be otherwise. I have been doing that. I've done that as editor of Art Education, really encouraging people to think about how pedagogy can be a disruptive practice. Wrapping it up now. And how it can lead people into unsuspected places. And I certainly try to do that in the Art in the Market program. If you want to find out more about what's happening in Art in the Market now, this is the link to the blog.